So from what I've understood from reading the book is that you've grown up in Pakistan. And then the narratives that we have, me being from India, you being from Pakistan, and someone being from Bangladesh, it's all very different. So can I ask you, what exactly compelled you to write this book to start with about Bangladesh being from Pakistan?
Yeah. I grew up in Pakistan. I grew up in Punjab, and as you would know, as a lot of folks listening in would know as well, there is so much silencing when it comes to 1971. It's a very uncomfortable period of history that Pakistan has still definitely not come to terms with, in my perspective. So growing up, there was a lot of silencing, and when 1971 was kind of talked about, whether that was in textbooks or in family, stories and so forth. It was kind of very rushed and hush hush for me. And for the longest time, I didn't really think much about 1971. I didn't really think much about Bangladesh either. I didn't really factor into my imagination. It was actually my first book, the book on Partition, that first prompted me to think a little bit more deeply. It kind of provoked something. And the reason being that when I was doing that book, I was not just looking at 1947 as a static event. I wanted to look at how the memory of 1947 had shifted. And what became really obvious to me very early on was that as a Pakistani, I had come across a very particular state narrative. But when I spoke with Indians, there was a very different state narrative, and that had an impact on people's memories as well, and how they kind of remembered, and how they kind of came to terms with partition. So for the first time, I was sitting there and I was kind of grappling with these two very distinct narratives, the Indian narrative on 1947 and the Pakistani narrative. And I started to think a little bit more about 1971 and how, whenever it is talked about in Pakistan, it is remembered as a loss, as the breakup, of the nation. It's referred to as the dismemberment. It's referred to as, the fall of Dhaka, and so forth. So, and I started to wonder, what is the narrative? What is the narrative in Bangladesh? So, because when you look at the 1947 partition in Pakistan, partition is very much linked to nation making. So even then, all the bloodshed and violence in the national imaginary, it is seen as something, that was a greater sacrifice for the greater good, and it led to something bigger, right? In India, it is registered as a loss. So I started to think about 71 and how there's that same kind of sense of loss in Pakistan, but of course it's referred to very differently. It is termed as liberation in Bangladesh, and I wanted to know more. So I think that became that entry point. But what also started to happen was that because I work with oral histories, and oral histories often, and I would say in fact always, really offer you a much more nuanced understanding of the past than state histories do. I was sitting with people from the partition generation for hours and hours for a few years. And in this anecdote or that, 1971 would keep coming up. And the years prior to 1971 would keep coming up. And for the first time in those utterances, I started to hear different anecdotes and stories that I had not come across. So people would, for example, talk about the discrimination against Bengalis. They would talk about Pakistan's policies, and they wouldn't go too deep into it, but it was enough for me to know that there was more to the story. So I think that also, this was back in 2010, 11, 12 that I'm doing this research, and I knew I had to go back at some point. But the final kind of entry point really became that this book I did on Kashmir, because when I was there and I was looking at India and Pakistan's policies, I realized that 71 is far more defining that a lot than a lot of us imagine in South Asia. I don't think it's given the kind of importance that it should be given, both in terms of the violence and the trauma and the people's loss, but also in terms of its imprints on the region. And so many of our policies, our dynamics in the region today are shaped by what happened in 1971. So that again brought me back. So for all of these reasons, as a Pakistani, I decided that I wanted to know what lay beyond the silencing, and I wanted to know more about the remembering in Bangladesh. And I think it's been it's obviously a very political project for me, but it's also very personal endeavor for me to kind of better understand my own history. So it's a long answer to your question, but it took me a while. It took me a while to get here. For the longest time, I didn't really think much about it, and then there were all these moments, that I kind of happened upon due to my other research that pushed me, that kept making me kind of realize that there's something more that I need to know if I really want to truly understand my own history and its impact on our present.
Well, that's interesting because when you read the book, you first, when from your perspective, you go into this, it's kind of a shock because the way you describe this, people see you in Bangladesh as the enemy somewhat, even though you weren't there at the time. You have not done these things, but just being there, you're seen as a representation or a symbol of Pakistan when you talk to these people.
Yes, and I think it has to be said with a lot of caution. I write about this in the book as well. I went there to know more about 1971, and so my encounters were far more charged than they would be, otherwise if I was just a tourist. Like everybody I met pretty much knew that I was there as a Pakistani researching on 1971, and because not only did the violence happen, but then there's been decades of denial of that violence. For a lot of people, I was the first Pakistani they were meeting. So there were a lot of charged emotions in the room. I was not there as a representative of the state, of course, and I was there to, in fact, if anything, try to challenge that status narrative. And a lot of people wanted to talk to me and share the stories because of that, but others were hesitant. How can we trust you? And how do we know you're not going to kind of distort our story, because there has been a legacy of that as well. So it was difficult to build trust, I would say, and it was a difficult journey, and there were a lot of feelings because they have not been processed, they have not been acknowledged, and I have a lot of understanding and compassion for that. So I think it has to always be kind of looked at. Those interactions have to be looked at in that light. Yeah.
So when you go about engaging in these interactions, I know that you've spoken about how you have a bit of a background in counseling, which may help you deal with these situations. But I see you say in the book that there's a difference in how maybe men and women respond to questions about the time of 1971. Perhaps maybe because women don't want to share their stories with you. Perhaps they don't feel comfortable in that environment, in that specific time and setting. Or maybe even perhaps they just I've heard you say before, the women just say, go and ask the men, they were there, we were inside, we weren't really. So they kind of reduce their own agency in what was obviously a very harrowing war. So what would you say is going about the gender response to war and the 1971 Liberation War?
Yeah, so I think that the gendered kind of response is always there when it comes to any war, any conflict. And this, what I've said earlier, what you just were referring to about, women often trivializing their own narratives is very pronounced when it comes to the 1947 partition. When I was doing that work, it would take me a lot of convincing to say, no, your story is important. I'm actually here just to hear your story. I don't want to go to the men in your family. One of the other things that this would happen even when I was doing the interviews in Kashmir is that when you're sitting in a room, these are often domestic settings. So you're in somebody's home, and it is often not just the one individual, but others will come into the room. And a lot of times when the men in the family would come into the room, they would end up speaking on behalf of women as well, and those conversations would kind of get interrupted and sometimes even hijacked. So I would have to do a lot of effort, like in redirecting the conversation back to the women that I was very curious about and I wanted to know more about. So of course you see that gendered experience of war and gendered response to war when it comes to 1971 as well. But I do think that there is a different nuance here, because Bangladesh did recognize the sexual violence that happened to women, right? And they were given the title of Birangana, or the war heroine. And when I went, this is in 2017, and there had been these efforts to kind of restore and recover and preserve memory, and women had come forth and shared their experiences. So I did speak with a lot of women who wanted to tell either their story or the stories of others, impacted in their family. A lot of people I had met, their parents were the ones who had been targeted and killed. So I think there was more of urgency to tell the story, and especially to tell the story to a Pakistani. And I think, again, this has to be looked at in terms of the post-war dynamics, where not only is there denial in Pakistan, but Bangladesh has gone through its own complex history, where there have been moments and years in between and regimes that have tried to kind of undermine that history as well. So therefore, there's this urgency to restore and recover. Having said that, of course, the dynamic of a woman sharing her story is so complicated. And I think anybody who's interested in this, the most nuanced and brilliant work that I've personally come across is Nayanika Mukherjee's Spectral Wound. And she talks about those nuances, about what is an open secret, in terms of what happened to women, but how much and where are they permitted to share, and what are some of the consequences that happen. So all of those dynamics kind of come into play in terms of memory and who is sharing and with whom are they sharing. And yeah.
Continuing on that, in the chapter Selective Silences, Selective Remembrances, you discuss how institutional silences can at times translate into personal silences as well. Do you think there's a way we can address these state-driven silences to create a more inclusive and accurate historical record that reflects all the diverse perspectives from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, in going on?
I hope so. I would like to believe so. I think, the work I do, there's been so much work in the past decade, 2 decades now, I would say, on oral histories, public memory. I think that is the hope, and that's where the efforts are kind of invested. But I'm also not overly optimistic, because it's hard to do this work against a whole state machinery, right, that is kind of deployed to silence people's experiences. And this is not just Pakistan. This happens in India. This is happening right now, when it comes to Israel. So states use these mechanisms to undermine indigenous struggles, and undermine those stories. And the danger that I see, especially because I do intergenerational work, so I also work with school children. So I work with, elders and their memories, firsthand memories. But then I look at how they kind of get transmitted, and I see the way in which they get packaged and repackaged and told and retold and distorted over time. And by the time they trickle down to the younger generations, who often have very limited access to that nuanced past, right, simply because people have passed away, right? They are only left with those jingoistic histories and those very selective histories. And that is probably what keeps me up at night. Because when I speak to children, obviously this is not the case with all children. There's so many factors that come into play in terms of family experience and oral histories that come across, and exposure and all of that. But for a lot of them, the state histories have become the histories, right? So when I was doing this work, for example, in 1971, and I went into Pakistani schools, a lot of children could not understand that history. I mean, for them, they wouldn't even know, for example, the numbers when it came to Bengalis, or that majority kind of spoke another language. For them, it was like, well, why couldn't they learn Urdu, right? Most children did not know that the Muslim League was actually founded in Dhaka, and that what was East Bengal played a very significant role in Pakistan's birth. So when you selectively omit, and when you kind of create counter narratives, it is a very dangerous game. Censorship doesn't just happen through a complete blanket removal. It can also happen through very curated, sophisticated techniques of and like it's essentially a craft, right? How do you take actual narratives from the past, but then filter them, right, and sift through them to the point in which the only thing that's left is just an iota of that truth, and a truth that only it's kind of convenient to your national history. And then how do you kind of create new narratives around that, right? And that's the story you tell. So I mean, I do worry about the penetration that these state narratives have and these official silences have. And against that, I think the only hope are people's narratives and people's memories, because there's a lot of debate and a lot of conversation, which I don't love engaging in, which is, about like our oral history is really true and they're too subjective and all of that. And firstly, I think that's the beauty of oral histories, that they are subjective, that they bring that lens. But I also think that in South Asia, where official histories are so biased and so partitioned, well, then sometimes these oral histories are the only way of understanding a more kind of diverse past, as you said, right? Because even when we talk about 1971 and when we talk about Bangladesh, there are also cases where, for example, somebody is a Punjabi Bangladeshi. Now, what is their experience? What is the experience of a Bengali Pakistani, right? Those nuances don't get told, right? When we're talking about sexual violence, when it comes to sexual violence as well, women are often treated as a homogenous entity. Their individual experiences are not captured. So I think that that's where like these kind of stories and this kind of work, this work can become really important. I also think that for me as well, the narratives I came across of people in Pakistan who had resisted the war, that I did not know about, right? But they were intellectuals, they were activists, they were women's rights activists, they were poets and so forth, who were active, and they were smaller in number, but they were up against significant odds. Some of them were jailed, they would be spat upon, right? But these are also incredibly inspiring stories. And they are a reminder that no matter how much, how oppressive states can be, there's always a resistance. And not only is there resistance in that moment, but by capturing those stories and by retelling that memory, you can continue to resist state erasure. So that's where my hope lies, but it is a very cautious hope, knowing that states do have a lot of power in how they penetrate. But I'll end here by just saying, I think no matter how much states try to homogenize our understanding, they are not ever fully successful. And I see that in the disruptions that oral histories bring, in the disruptions that personal memories bring, and that gives me a lot of hope. Yeah.
That's interesting. Thank you for that answer. If we go back to 1947 and we look, so when I read your book, I see that people in Bangladesh don't view 1947 as the same way in India we do as independence. We celebrate it. It's very important to us. In Bangladesh, you said it's more of a footnote or it's an endnote. They don't, for them, it's just a lead up to the 1971 Liberation War. In Bangladesh, what is exactly the memory of 1947 compared to 1971? And is 1971 viewed as it was always going to happen after the events of 1947, or could things have gone differently?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So today it is kind of, I mean, at least in the interviews that I did, which were of course limited. I only spent so much time there, but in my research and in looking back in hindsight, today people very much see it as inevitable. 71 as inevitable. That is how it's kind of framed and remembered and told. And when it comes to 1947, it is kind of reduced in history because 1971 happens, right? It is the event that looms large, right? And in a way, it overshadows everything that happened prior to it. So then 1947 becomes almost, as some people put it, a delay in the actual and final liberation, right? And of course, many would argue that Bangladesh continues to go through its own process of, really, truly, has it been fully liberated? Are there many challenges that the nation faces? Of course, those are ongoing debates in any country, I think. But yeah, when it comes to 47, it's kind of seen as that delay. I think it is also very much, the conversations are around economic emancipation. And how Pakistan was supposed to promise that, and how there was a lot of disillusionment because there, like as I mentioned before, Muslim League was founded in Dhaka and there was significant support, and that support is remembered again in terms of economic emancipation, but and as early as like 48, late 47, 48, tensions are kind of brewing, right, over language. By 52, you have students being killed over language rights. So there's that disillusionment that is then kind of remembered. And and then, the memory of 71 tends tends to dominate everything else. And yeah, I think it is very different in how it is imagined and remembered than it is in Pakistan and in India today. And yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's interesting, because when we speak of minority communities, a very specific question here.
Yeah.
How do you think the concept of loyalty intersects with ethnic and cultural identity during the 1971 war, particularly for marginalized groups like the Biharis? Considering their unique position as Urdu-speaking Muslims in East Pakistan, how did their loyalties affect their treatment during and after the conflict?
Yeah, so with the Urdu speaking community, and they often referred to as Biharis, even though they come from places other than Bihar as well, they were kind of given preferential treatment by the Pakistani state, and they were kind of seen as closer to the Pakistani state. And we have to remember that there we're talking about partition, we're talking about 71. There's also an entire colonial legacy that I think none of the three states kind of engage with enough, right? But a lot of what you see between 1947 and 71 is a continuation of that colonial legacy as well. So, for example, the martial race theory that was deployed by the British, this idea that some races are more superior, and some are more inferior, continues to inform Pakistan's policies after 1947 in Bangladesh, and therefore, Bengalis are kind of seen as racially inferior. And there are all these stereotypes about them. And in comparison, the Urdu-speaking community is seen as closer to the Pakistani establishment, Pakistani state, and they're given preference in jobs and so forth. So there's that material kind of difference that starts to emerge. And when 1971 happens, a lot of, members of the Urdu-speaking community have their allegiance to the Pakistani state, and when the Pakistan Army enters, some of them also collaborate with the army in helping them identify targets and so forth. When I spoke with the Urdu-speaking community, many of them said, we had no choice; we were also forced. So there are a lot of nuanced dynamics over there. Of course, not everybody also partook, but many did collaborate with the Pakistan Army. And so there was that, idea of like, are you going to be loyal to maintaining national integrity? Because that's how it is being framed, right? That there are enemy elements at play over here trying to break up the nation. It is not being framed as a movement for rights and as a just movement for liberation, of course. And we see that same dynamic play out in Kashmir. We see that same dynamic play out in Palestine right now. So because it is framed as this threat to national integrity, right? Who is going to be on the side of the Pakistani state to maintain the sanctity of the state? And the Urdu-speaking community is kind of seen as that community. And again, they're being treated as a monolith, and the reality is more complex. But when 1971 happens, the Urdu-speaking community prior to the army operation also gets targeted, right? Because now they're seen as kind of representatives of the state by this point. And so there is violence against them. And the Pakistan Army actually uses this violence as a justification to enter, to say, well, the Bengalis have gone unruly, and I'm quoting here, right? And the Pakistan state needs to enter and rectify this. And of course, that's weaponized essentially. And the army action is they try to legitimate it and rationalize it on this basis. But once the war is over, the Urdu-speaking community is kind of left to their own devices, in a sense. Now they are framed as collaborators. It doesn't matter if every single individual helped or, even were loyal to the Pakistani state or not. That doesn't matter, because now, they are seen as this monolithic group of which, some did collaborate and some did, side with the Pakistan Army. And they are not rescued by the Pakistani state either. They're kind of left. So some are taken, but others are not. There are hundreds and thousands of them that continue to live in Bangladesh today. And now that it's been over 50 years, there are new dynamics at play, because those in the elder generation often, continue to cling on to this hope that Pakistan would own them. And they had become stateless for a long time until the 2008 Supreme Court judgment. But then there are those who were born in a post-liberated Bangladesh, and Bangladesh is the only country they know, right? And so for them, survival has been about how do we make our place over here. So then new questions of loyalties emerge, right? So when I went in 2017, I did do some interviews within the Geneva camp, where a large number of the speaking community resides still, and you could see those tensions between generations as well, where those in the elder generation, I mean, they've never been able to, they were not owned, and they don't feel a sense of belonging there, and they're still seen as collaborators. So they, still, when I went as a Pakistani individual, some people traveled for days to come and see me, even though I could do nothing but to say, well, Pakistan had made this promise. We're still waiting. But then you have those in the younger generation saying, no, we want to get rid of this association so that we can actually, survive and live and belong here now as Bangladeshis. So those implications are very real for communities on the margins. You also have that dynamic in a different way, of course. It's not directly comparable, but with the Bengali Pakistanis. And they face a lot of obstacles in obtaining ID cards and basic documentation they need. And questions of loyalty often emerge. So I think in a post-partition world, national identity and religious identities have become so synonymous that minorities in all three of these nations really face those consequences, and their loyalty and patriotism, it's constantly put under test and questioned, and there are severe consequences when they don't meet that arbitrary threshold.
That's interesting, because if you can, in your book, you highlighted communalism, which erupted in partition, but did not end in 1947 or even in 1971. Because you mentioned that in Bengal, the refugee crisis that went on was a protracted engagement with communal tensions and the crystallization of religious identities continuing to impact community spheres. Could you elaborate a bit on how these ongoing communal tensions and the process, you mentioned this word otherization in the book, of Hindus have shaped the social landscape for them in Bangladesh since 1971?
Since 1971. So, of course, my research is primarily on 1971, and I think many others have done more extensive work and can speak more closely to that. But from what I know, of course, again, these histories cannot be so neatly kind of divided as pre and post. I think the legacies that continue, as I was saying earlier, like the colonial legacy kind of continues to shape that relationship. And then what happens between 47 and 71 also shapes what happens after 71, right? But when I did interview the Hindu community, there is a marginalization, there is an otherization. And I think what's happened in post-liberation Bangladesh is that depending on what party is in power, there are certain equations that are made. So to put it in very, very like crude, simple terms, when Awami League is in power, it is kind of seen as pro-liberation, as secular, as pro-India. When BNP is in power, it is seen as more Islamist, and it is seen as anti-liberation by some forces, and it is seen as pro-Pakistan. And so almost there's like this proxy war that continues to play out, and it has consequences for minorities. And that is not to say that those consequences for Hindu minorities only there when BNP is in power. I believe it is very much so, from my understanding from my conversations, also when the Awami League is in power, and that question of belonging continues to come up. And I think what ends up happening, and this is something that all states do, is that they weaponize these fractures between communities and in histories, and this otherization and this demonization, to use it for the national project as it is effective and as necessary. essentially. So I think that dynamic plays out in Bangladesh as well. But my focus is more so, what happened to the Hindu community prior, and there you see that, I mean, even as growing up in Punjab, I was under the impression that East Pakistan had a Hindu majority. Why did I have that notion? Because by the time I'm growing up in the late 80s and 90s, Hindu and India has become synonymous, right? And therefore the enemy. And so if you kind of explain it away as a large Hindu population, well, then were they ever truly Pakistani? Do you understand that question starts to get raised, and then you can almost explain it away. And I think I lost my train of thought when you asked that earlier question. So I'm going to go back to it because I think it's linked here as well. When you were asking me about 71 versus 1947 and the inevitability of it, I think I was going to say that from a Bangladeshi perspective, it is kind of seen as inevitable. It's kind of seen as that delayed process, and that ongoing movement for decolonization is continues till 1971 happens. But from Pakistan's perspective as well, it is always treated as inevitable. And how do you frame it as inevitable? By putting these kinds of seeds in people's minds. Well, it was a largely Hindu population, which is not firstly even factually correct, but even if that is the case, so what, right? But if Hindu and India is now synonymous and it is the enemy, well, then you're saying, of course, how could it remain part of Pakistan? It had to happen, right? Then you will say things like, well, there was hostile territory in between. A lot of people, very well learned people, will ask me this question even today. Well, wasn't it an absurd idea that the two states, East and West Pakistan, could remain together with hostile territory in the middle? And my answer always is, borders were not imagined and understood the way we understand them today in hindsight, right? People would keep crossing over, and especially in what is today Bangladesh, that migration was a lot more fragmented and fractured than it was in Punjab. So people would keep kind of crossing over. So it was not as absurd. But this question of inevitability, from a Pakistani lens, I think is problematic, because when we treat history as inevitable, then no kind of reckoning or reflection is even required, right? Because then it is just done. And so, your question on how this otherization happens, that otherization plays into crafting this narrative about it being inevitable. Because once you otherize the communities, then they are the other. So even today, like, the loss of East Pakistan is not a loss of people. It is seen as a loss of territory that is difficult for Pakistan to come to terms with. And I think that is a very, very deeply problematic framing and remembering of what happened. And I think that legacy then, of course, continues to have impact in post-1971 as well on religious minorities that continue to face that otherization and communalism, in different ways, and manifest in different ways. And
thank you for that answer. Sticking on the topic of Bengal, something which I learned reading your book, and it dispels maybe a common narrative that exists, that in India, people didn't want partition. In Pakistan, people felt that partition was necessary. So in Bengal specifically, in your book, you say that it's actually not like that, that there's a strong Bengali Hindu community, the upper class community, that did actually want partition just as much as the Muslim League did for Pakistan. Could you delve a bit more into that, into what is the actual narrative?
Yeah, so I think the book that I referenced, Bengal Divided by Chatterjee, I think that was an eye-opening book for me to kind of refer to, because I think these state narratives have so much impact, right? And not just, I think, within India and Pakistan, I also think they kind of continue to shape partition's narrative internationally. So it is a very simplistic narrative of, the Muslim League kind of is at the forefront of this breakup, and it has this demand for Pakistan, and then Pakistan is created, and in the Indian imaginary, of course, it very quickly, it skips events, and there's this lot of omission. So it jumps from the Quit India movement to the Muslim League wanting Pakistan, and then Pakistan becomes a terrorist country. Full stop. That is the equation, right? But even in Pakistan, that is kind of often internalized. But the reality is a lot more complex, and I think we need to refer to books and scholars like this, as well as Dr. Aisha Jalal's work, that problematizes this and talks about the kind of negotiation that Jinnah was trying to lead, and the role of the Congress. But I think particularly when it comes to Bengal, what happens is that a lot of tension at the time of partition is about who's going to have economic control and control over land, right? And the Badra Lok are also concerned with that idea of what's going to happen post partition, right? If they become a minority. So there is this push from that end as well for partition to happen. And there are elements in the Congress as well. So it is not as simple as the Muslim League wanting Pakistan. There is a whole history prior to that of trying to negotiate rights for Muslims and minorities within an undivided India, right? And then the push for Pakistan does not only come, or the push for partition does not only come from the Muslim League either. But that is a history that is much more forgotten now, because it is not a convenient history. It is far more convenient to say, well, the Muslim League, almost now in today's framing, in post 9/11, with the rise of Islamophobia, can almost frame it as, those extremist elements wanting a separate nation, and then look what happens to Pakistan. It becomes a terrorist country. It becomes a fundamentalist country. I'm talking about tropes over here. I want to make that very clear. I'm talking about stereotypes and tropes and how it's framed. So that is a much easier history to digest than a more complicated history where, well, no, actually there were elements in the Congress that also wanted partition. And there was, conflict over power and economic interests. Do we want to tell that? Do we want to tell that story? It's not as simple and digestible as the other one. So that's what happens, I think. And so these narratives have been internalized both in India and in Pakistan and in the international framing of partition. But Joya Chatterjee's book is, I think, an excellent kind of disruption of that, and I would refer everybody to it. Yeah.
That's interesting. We have because I know you wanted to keep this to about an hour, so we have about 20 minutes left. I'll ask a few more questions, and I'll just open it up to anyone who wants to ask a few questions in the chat perhaps. How do you think these narratives, or maybe the parts of history that we just spoke now, which are left out, do you think nowadays with the rise of technology, there's more scholarship being done on these, do you think that will change perhaps in the future how we remember things at an institutional level? Or do you think that things will remain the same and we'll have to look to specific books, we'll have to do our own research, let's say, per se, to find out the truth?
I feel like at the end of all the talks I give, there's a hope that I will be optimistic, and I kind of shatter that every time. I would like to believe so. I think there are a lot of efforts right now. I think that post-pandemic, there's been a new kind of opening as well, because of conversations like these have become so much more frequent. There are so many platforms that are bringing together folks, and interesting conversations are happening. Really great scholarship is happening. I think we also have to keep in mind there's a lot of fantastic scholarship happening in vernacular and regional languages that often does not make it to the center stage because English literature tends to dominate. Just to say that incredible work is happening. I think I'm seeing a little bit more proliferation of it as well through technology, especially with these conversations that have become much more common after the pandemic, people leveraging these platforms. But Arko, I think I have to be honest when I say that state machineries just have a lot of power. They do have a lot of power. And unless there's a disruption there, I worry that all these efforts that I try to engage in as well will have limited outreach. They have significant impact, but they have limited outreach. So one of the questions is also, who's going to tune into these conversations and from what lens? Now, one of the tensions that or complications that I face with the work that I do, if I'm very honest, is my work often gets appropriated by the different states in selective ways, in ways that is convenient to them. So I'm conscious about where I talk about my work, and on what platforms, because it is so easy for somebody to tune in from India and say, yes, Pakistan, oppressive state, 1971. All of that is absolutely true. It was a genocide, and I want to be very clear about that. But are you going to engage with that history without engaging with what's happening in Kashmir right now and Indian states policies? Do you want to selectively, tune in and listen to one kind of history without reckoning fully with your own history, right? And Pakistanis do this as well. And so that is my problem, because even when you're putting out information, right, who is listening? Sometimes people will, in fact, write to me, and I find this very, very funny, because they, if I'm ever writing something and I'm critical of the Indian state's policies in Kashmir, people will say, have you looked at what Pakistan did in Bangladesh in 1971? I will say, actually, yes, I have. I have a book on that, So my point is, we need to get past our selective biases as well and realize that bubbles exist. Right? Bubbles exist. And so people will often kind of reach out for confirmation bias. So I think it's about how it's about state penetration, but it also comes down to our curiosity, our willingness to unlearn, our willingness to engage with uncomfortable histories. I think I've said this before, we need to get more comfortable with being uncomfortable, because our histories are deeply uncomfortable. Our present is deeply uncomfortable. And if we are more comfortable with that, then yes. But otherwise, I think states have their convenient histories that will continue to be furthered, and the damage of that across generations is very dire, and I worry it's going to get worse.
Continuing on that, Bangladesh has been trying to very actively get 1971 recognized as a genocide in the global community, going to the UN, going through different international organizations. Right now, we see with what's happening in Israel, Gaza, like in the present time, we also see people trying to get this recognized as a do you see any similarities in the two, 1971 and right now, 2024, what's playing out?
Absolutely. I think there are so many parallels. Essentially, I think there is a genocide playbook and toolkit that states use. And it is almost unreal how many of those parallels are kind of at play right now, So whether it is dehumanization of an entire population, framing them as terrorists, right? And even you can then legitimate attacking refugee camps because terrorists live here, right? In Pakistan's framing of Bengalis, they are framed as terrorists. Those who are fighting for their rights, Kashmiris are framed as terrorists. Then you want to, point towards what are supposedly enemy states who are interfering. So whether that is, you want to talk about Iran, or you want to talk about India, or you want to talk about Pakistan, depending on which conflict, which war, which violence you're looking at, right? The false equivalency between people picking up arms and fighting for their rights, and an entire state machinery with tanks and armor, right? You absolutely see that. You see the neutralization of violence by playing a number game. So many of your people died, but so many of our people died, right? Maximizing and minimizing communities' violence and pain, depending on what's convenient. So what happened with Bangladesh and Pakistan's memory is that the violence against the Urdu-speaking community, which is real, is maximized, right? And violence against Bengalis and other ethnic minorities is minimized. These are very sophisticated tools, as I was saying earlier, right? Erasure and censorship is not just through blanket removal or whitewashing. It is also through the deployment of these kinds of techniques. And you see that so much at play right now, and the kind of propaganda and outreach these state machineries have is alarming. So yeah, I see those dynamics very much at play today, and it is very disturbing that the world has not learned, and we will see more of this. We will continue to see this kind of unfold because this playbook is essentially being allowed to and play out. And in the case of Israel and Gaza, and right now is of course that there's an enablement of that genocide, and of course the U.S. played a significant role in what happened in 1971 as well. So there are many parallels.
So we're seeing that history tends to repeat itself if there is no reflection, if there is no reconciliation. I mean, let's take India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. Do you think there's any chance of reconciliation between these three countries given the current geopolitical climate?
I think there are going to be periods where things get better. We've had those periods, before. I remember when I started doing exchange projects between Indian and Pakistani students. I was working for Pakistani Nonprofit Citizens Archive. Visas had become easier. There was conversation about over 65-year-olds being able to travel across the border. There have been moments when Pakistan and Bangladesh's relations have become better. But I think there's so many fractures in this history that have not been addressed. I think people talk about apology. I think prior to an apology, or a prerequisite for an apology, is an acknowledgement of history, and our own complicity, the ways in which we complicit and enable this history. And that has not happened. It's very easy for us to point fingers at each other, right? So I think, is there hope? Can there be reconciliation? Of course, I would like to believe so, and I think that's absolutely possible. But I think there has to be a far more deeper reckoning and reflection that is necessary at the state level, and then that will penetrate. I see that happening in the near term? I don't, but I hope that changes.
I just have one last question I'll leave, because I do have a bunch of, but I don't think we can go through all of them. So I'll leave with one question, because I'm myself interested in writing, and we do work at a research institute where we do a lot of research. We're looking into writing books. Given the difficulty, because you mentioned the difficulty you had in securing a visa, in general being around Bangladesh. Could you go a bit into that, the difficulties you faced in trying to travel to Bangladesh and write about Bangladesh? And then also, is there anything that you think that you missed out on, or if you were given the chance to go back to, you would want to include?
Yeah, that's a great question. I faced a lot of difficulties. I was naive. I had internalized some narratives, as much as I would like to believe that, I was far more aware by the time I was doing this book, but I had also internalized narratives. Pakistan, it frames like Bangladesh as a brotherly nation. India's kind of the problem in its framing. And because I had been to India several times, and it's very difficult to get visas, but I had been fortunate enough to travel, I thought, how difficult can Bangladesh be? But it was incredibly difficult. This is 2017, so the war crime tribunals were happening, and Pakistan had denounced them, and Bangladesh was very upset about this. And so tensions had further kind of escalated at this time, and I would not get a visa. Could not get a visa. It was very difficult to get even an invitation letter, because, do you really want to be the one who's called a Pakistani over? Do you want to create that trouble for yourself? So eventually, I had to reach out to a lot of people I knew who had some connections in Bangladesh, and I was finally able to make it there. But I got a visa for 2 weeks. My initial intention when I proposed this book, when I thought about it, was that I was going to travel several times over a couple of years to Bangladesh and to India. But as it happened, tensions between India and Pakistan also escalated, and I've been to India several times, but I was not able to go for this research. And so I had to rethink how I do this work. And I also knew that I'm going to be talking to people about 71. These are trauma memories, and what are the ethics involved of doing this? So I was very conscious about who I reached out to. I actively did not go and kind of search for stories that had not been shared or untold stories. I spoke to people who either wanted to tell the story to a Pakistani, or they trusted the person who introduced us. And so that kind of made them a little bit more comfortable. I did not push. I If I could go back, that's a great question. Nobody's asked me that before. I would do far more research. I would do more in-depth research. I would like to travel around. I only went to Dhaka and Khulna. I think there is a whole history that is, of course, being approached by Bangladeshi scholars in incredible ways, but there's more work to be done in terms of other ethnic minorities, apart from the Urdu-speaking community, and the impact on them of the war. That is something I would like to do more of. The gendered lens, that was something that was very limited in this book, again, because of issues of ethics and trust and all of that. So I wish I could have spent more time. I think the book would have been more extensive in its research. I would have liked to spend more time in Bengal, in India, as well, understanding those dynamics, because we didn't talk about that today. We didn't get into it, but India has its own narrative, of course, about 1971 in Bangladesh, and it often treats it as an India-Pakistan war and as a win over Pakistan. But when you speak to people in the bordering areas, the reality is more complex, and the implications of refugees coming in and how that continues to shape Indian politics and local politics. What we saw happening in Assam, and the anti-CAA protests, all of that kind of in many ways links back to 1971 as well. So I touched upon that in the book, but had I been able to spend extensive time, I would have loved to go deeper into those dynamics. Yeah.
That's really interesting, because I think ethics, especially around sensitive stuff, that is the most important thing. I think there's been a loss of that perhaps in the media landscape in recent times, the need to assess and be ethical when considering and collecting information. I think a lot of the time now people rush to just get something out or be the first or things. So there's a lack of respect for, I think, people's privacy one. And
yeah. So I don't mean to interrupt you, but yeah, I feel very strongly about that. I think in my early years as well, I know that push and drive, and you want to be the one telling the story, and you want to break it and all of that. But sorry, I'm losing my voice. But you have to remember that for people, this is not a story that they get to walk away from. This is their life, and there are so many ethics involved in doing this work. And because I was going to leave, I cannot even kind of maintain those relationships in person. I can't check in. I can't do a follow-up. So what does that mean? So I had to hold myself back and limit the research I did. And a very legitimate critique of the book can be that it is limiting in its scope. It is. I don't want it to be seen as something that is trying to make tall claims or generalizations. It is very much about the people that I spoke to and the experiences I had. But that was the only ethical way for me to continue this work.
Thank you, ma'am, so much for that answer. I'll just end by asking, are you working on anything right now?
I am. It's still in its very early stages, but it is looking at mob violence, particularly in South Asia, India and Pakistan.
Is there a rough timeline for this book, or?
No, I'm trying not to put one on myself, because I'm trying to write this in a much more experimental way. And this is all the work that I've done has been difficult because of the violence that it touches upon. But mob violence, it's very difficult to process and write about. So I'm just giving myself the time I need. But hopefully it will see the light of day at some point. Yeah.
And well, if and when it does, perhaps you'd like to join back here for another one of these.
No, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. These were really great questions, really thoughtful questions. Thank you for engaging with my work. I hope I was able to answer. But if there's something else that comes up, please feel free to reach out. Yeah.
Not just me, I think for anyone, Indian, Bangladeshi, or Pakistani, this book is very important, because I think, and I've heard you say this before, oral history is history. There is no differentiating between the two. If someone was there at the time they lived that experience, that happened. There is no this or that.
Absolutely. I firmly believe that. Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Thank you so much.
thank you so much. Have a good day, and well, goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.